Hello and welcome to TurnItIn Assignments, Part 1, Create TurnItIn Assignments in Brightspace. This is Professor Valerie Powell from Wilbur Wright College, one of the city colleges of Chicago, and I'll be your host for this training session. For today's training, the Brightspace team is making some assumptions about its trainees. First, we assume that you've completed the Brightspace Foundations training so that you have some familiarity already with navigating Brightspace. Next, we assume that you understand something very important about Brightspace, namely that there are many workflows. This presentation represents just one workflow for creating Turnitin assignments in Brightspace. Nevertheless, it's the one that we think works best, so we're sharing it with you. We also assume that you have a desire to use Turnitin for providing feedback to your students. There's also an assumption that you want your Turnitin assignments to integrate well with the Brightspace gradebook. Not all workflows allow Turnitin to sort of talk to the Brightspace gradebook as effectively as this one. So it's really important that this assumption is true of you. Finally, our last assumption is that you will return for part 2 of this presentation, which will cover how to grade Turnitin assignments. Here is our agenda for part 1 of the Turnitin assignments training session. In this session, you will learn to create submission folders from the Assignments tool, learn how to set submission folder properties, learn to adjust submission folder restrictions, learn to enable Turnitin and adjust its settings. We will also recap the main ideas from this presentation, and we will look ahead to the next training session, Part 2, Grading Turnitin Assignments. Create an assignment submission folder. To begin, find the Assessments tab in the nav bar. Once you've clicked on Assessments, a drop-down window will appear. Click on the Assignment area from that drop-down window. Now you are in the Assignments tool. Click the blue button that says New Submission Folder. You might be asking yourself, what is a submission folder? A submission folder is a container where students can digitally submit their work. If you want students to submit their work digitally to Brightspace, a submission folder must be created. While this is not the only way to create a submission folder, it is the way to create one that utilizes Turnitin. When you're in the New Submission Folder page, notice that there are several tabs across the top. First, you'll notice the Properties tab. Next, you'll notice the Restrictions tab. After that, you'll notice the Objectives tab. And finally, you'll notice the Turnitin tab. What's important to note here is that you should move through these tabs from left to right, and that as you move from one tab to the other, the work that you do should save automatically. Submission Folder Properties tab. Setting the folder properties for a new submission folder. When you begin to set your folder properties in the Folder Properties tab, the first thing you may notice is that the page is really long and that it has many important components. Make sure you scroll all the way down so that you set all of the properties before moving on to the next tab. The first thing you'll notice is that you must set the assignment name. This is a mandatory field for the Properties tab. The next field is the folder type. This is where you can decide if this is an individual submission folder or a group submission folder. Most of the time, you'll leave it set to the default, which is the individual student. Occasionally, you may set it to a group submission for something like a group project. Please note that if you want to change it to a group submission, you'll need to have groups created in the Groups tool of Brightspace before setting up a group submission folder. Next, you'll notice an area for assignment categories. Assignment categories are ones that group similar assignments together. For example, as an English instructor, I might want to have an assignment category that groups together all of my MLA practice assignments, or even all of my grammar assignments, or maybe even all of my drafts. These are categories that are unique to the Assignments tool. Although the same word category is used in the Gradebook tool, assignment categories and Gradebook categories are not the same thing. They're similar, but they're not the same. Assignment categories, just like gradebook categories, are optional. You don't need to create them. From the Brightspace Foundations training, you learn that creating an assignment in Brightspace doesn't necessarily tie that assignment to the gradebook. So when you follow this workflow, you'll need to create a new grade item. You can see that this assignment I'm creating right now is not tied to the gradebook because under the grade item heading, it says none. I want this assignment to be tied to the gradebook, so I'll click on the new grade item link. When I click on this link, a pop-up window will allow me to create all the settings and properties for the grade item. In the new grade item window, there are several areas to complete. Before we look at the headings, please notice that there is a scroll bar here, so you don't want to forget to scroll down. First is the assignment name. You'll likely input the same name from the assignment submission folder properties. It doesn't automatically filter over. Next is the short name. The short name is a name for the assignment that is abbreviated so that your gradebook columns aren't as wide. This is optional. Then you have the gradebook category. Users may or may not use gradebook categories. If you're someone who tends to weigh your grades and you already have your gradebook set up with weighted categories, this is where you can associate a particular assignment to a gradebook category weight. If you're not someone who does that, then leave it set to none. Next is the maximum points possible. You will need to remember this number. Let me repeat. You need to remember this number. You will need to provide it in the assignment submission folder properties in a moment. There are a few other settings that you can scroll down to access, but they're fairly specialized and won't apply to most users. So at this point, I will simply click Save. When I do this, the pop-up window will disappear and I will return to the new submission folder properties page. When you return to the submission folder properties page, you should see the grade item listed in the drop-down window. Where it said none before, it should now say the name of your tied grade item. You should also notice that the area has turned blue. This tells you that the assignment and the grade item are linked. If you don't see the name of your grade item, click on the drop-down window and select it. Now, remember how I just mentioned that you will need to remember the maximum points possible for your grade item? Well, this is where you will need it. Under the Out of heading on the Submission Folder Properties page, input the same maximum points possible for the assignment that you put in the grade item. Once you've put in the number for the maximum points possible, in this case 10, you'll notice that right below there's a heading called Student View Preview. This shows how the score will look to students in the gradebook. The next heading you'll find in the new submission folder properties is Rubrics. You can add a Brightspace created rubric to your assignment in this area. Click Add a Rubric if you've created one before creating the submission folder. You can create a rubric directly from this area. Once you've selected a rubric, it will become the default scoring rubric. Next, you will provide instructions for the assignment in this area. You'll notice a checkbox for the ePortfolio submission permission. I generally leave this checked in case I decide later to create an ePortfolio activity for students. An ePortfolio allows students to submit a select number of previously submitted items to the instructor for assessment as a collection. It's kind of like a digital binder or digital portfolio. Then, you can also attach files for students to access. Next, you'll see a heading for submission types. Here you will decide upon the submissions you'll accept. If you click the drop-down arrow, you'll see two different options. The default is file-based submission, which means students need to upload a file of some kind, like a Microsoft Word document or a PDF. If you select this, Brightspace will not allow students to submit something to the assignment folder unless there is an attachment. The other option is text submission. This will allow students to type their work into Brightspace directly into the text box. No attachment will be required. Next, you'll see a heading for the number of submissions that are allowed. The default is unlimited. You may leave this as is, or you may change it to one file per submission folder. Below that, you'll see another heading for submissions, which is asking you to decide which submission Brightspace will keep for you to see. The default is all submissions. If you allow Brightspace to keep all submissions, you may end up with several submissions from the same student. The next option is to only keep the most recent submission. In this case, if a student submits on 2 separate occasions, the second occasion will remove the first submission and replace it with a new document. The last option is only one submission is ever allowed. This means that a student only has one chance to submit one document or submission. Believe it or not, we've now reached the end of the Submission Folder Properties tab. We started at the top and worked our way all the way down through all of these properties. Now we need to scroll all the way back up to the top to the tabs at the top of the new Submission Folder Properties window. We'll locate the Restrictions tab next and click on it. When we move from the Properties tab to the Restrictions tab, Brightspace will save the properties automatically. Submission Folder Restrictions tab. We are now in the Restrictions tab. First, notice that the title has changed to the name I gave the assignment. The first checkbox is super important. You'll notice that it's checked by default, which means the assignment is hidden from students by default. If you want students to see the assignment, you'll need to click the box to remove the checkmark. Once you've unchecked the Hidden from Students box, you'll notice that the whole larger area turns blue. It's in this area that you can set the dates for the assignment. You can click the Due Dates box so you can add a due date for the assignment in Brightspace. You can also set the start and end dates for Brightspace. Start and end dates make the assignment appear and disappear from student view. Next, you'll see an area where you can set release conditions. Although I'm not going to go over release conditions today, they're a cool feature you might want to check out. Finally, there is a special access area. This is where you can adjust settings for particular students. For example, you might have a student who has special accommodations through the Disability Access Center. It's here where you might provide special access for that one particular student. Now it's time to finish the Restrictions tab. We return to the tabs at the top of the page. You'll notice that Objectives is the next tab. I'm going to skip the Objectives tab for now and go directly to the TurnItIn tab. When I select the TurnItIn tab directly from Restrictions, Brightspace should save the work that I did in the Restrictions tab automatically. Submission Folder, TurnItIn tab. We are now in the TurnItIn tab. Begin by selecting Enable GradeMark under the GradeMark Evaluation heading. GradeMark is the TurnItIn tool that allows instructors to mark up and give comments to students' papers. Now this next step is probably the most important thing to remember and probably the most important thing that I will show you in this presentation. Under the Transfer heading, select Automatically Sync Grades as Draft in Brightspace. Again, I want to repeat that this is really the most important step. You must select Automatically Sync Grades as Draft in Brightspace. If you don't select Automatically Sync, getting the scores from TurnItIn into the Brightspace gradebook will take many more steps. So please remember to select Automatically Sync Grades as Draft in Brightspace. You must change it from the default, which is Manually Sync Grades. So make sure that you choose Automatically Sync Grades as Draft in Brightspace. Now you can set the properties for TurnItIn's Originality reports. Originality check is the TurnItIn tool that helps instructors and students detect and deter plagiarism. Instructors can decide if they want the assignment to have an originality report generated. Under the Display heading, you can decide if you want to allow students to see their originality report, which will highlight how similar their work is to the other work in TurnItIn systems. Under the Frequency heading, you can decide if you want all submissions by all students to be checked for originality or just some. If you want an originality report generated for all students, select Automatic Originality Checking on all submissions. If you only want specific student papers to have originality reports generated, select Identify Individual Submissions for originality checking. At the bottom of this tab, you'll notice a button for more TurnItIn options. This will open another pop-up window with more settings and more options for TurnItIn. In the More TurnItIn Options pop-up window, notice the title and points have filtered over from Brightspace. Also notice that this is where peer mark may be enabled. Notice also that there is another button for some even more optional settings. Let's take a look at these additional settings. The TurnItIn optional settings is another long page that you'll need to work through completely and click Submit before moving on. First, you'll notice the Storage drop-down box. Under the Storage drop-down box, you can decide to have this assignment be submitted and kept by TurnItIn in their standard repository. The other option is Do not store the submitted papers to the standard repository. If the paper is a draft that will have subsequent drafts, make sure that you do not store the papers. Otherwise, the subsequent drafts will come up as unoriginal because TurnItIn will think the final draft is plagiarizing the first draft. TurnItIn suggests only submitting final drafts to the standard repository. Next, you can change the setting to allow different file types and late submissions. The next checkbox allows you to enable grammar checking through TurnItIn's ETS system. You can also decide to let ETS grammar and spell check to only look at certain aspects of the writing, like grammar and usage and style. If you're one to create and use TurnItIn rubrics, this is where you would attach the rubric to the assignment. Finally, this area is where you can set the types of materials against which you want your student work compared, such as articles or other student papers. Scrolling down, we now see Similarity Report Generation. This is where we can decide when and how a similarity or originality report is generated. Click the drop-down menu to see the different options. There are also other settings that you can change in terms of the similarity reports. Check the boxes that you want to use for your assignment. Next, under the Additional Settings heading, you can decide if you want to save these settings for future use. If you do, then the settings you've created on this particular assignment in TurnItIn will be the default for future TurnItIn assignments. Now this step is really important. You have to click Submit in this TurnItIn pop-up window to save these settings. Once you click Submit, you will be done with the TurnItIn pop-up windows and you will return to the TurnItIn tab in Brightspace. We are now back in the Brightspace submission folder. The setup of TurnItIn is now complete. We have made our way across the tabs of the submission folder, so now it's time to select Save and Close because our assignment has been created. Now that our assignment has been created, it's time to double check a few things. First, let's check out the assignment name. Make sure it's correct. Next, let's check to see that TurnItIn is integrated. We can tell that it is when we see the binoculars icon. Then it's important to make sure that the assignment is connected to the gradebook. This little ribbon will tell us that it has been linked to the gradebook successfully. Creating a Turnitin assignment recap. Now let's recap the main ideas from this presentation. 1. Start in the Assessments tab of the nav bar. 2. Select Assignments from the drop-down menu. 3. Create an assignment new submission folder. 4. Complete the Properties tab. Remember, that tab is really long. You can create a new grade item directly from this tab. Also, you'll need to input the assignment name and points in two different windows. 5. The Restrictions tab makes the assignment available for students and sets dates for the assignments. 6. Skip the Objectives tab. It's optional. 7. The TurnItIn tab enables TurnItIn. This is where you need to change the setting to automatically sync grades, so your grades will easily flow to the Brightspace gradebook. 8. Save and close when you're done with the assignment. And last but not least, 9. Double check the assignment icons. The binoculars mean the assignment is linked to TurnItIn, and the ribbon means it's tied to the gradebook. Well, we finished this part of the training. Please make sure to check out the second part of this training, which will show you how to grade your students, so the feedback is easily available to them in Brightspace. Thank you for joining me today. If you have any questions about this presentation or Brightspace in general, please contact your local faculty champion, your local technology integration specialist, or the CCC Help Desk. This is Professor Valerie Pell signing off. I hope you have a bright day in Brightspace.